This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I expect some of you watched the funeral of Mandela at Kunu. I hope some of you watched it on television. And you may recall, if you did, that the most powerful speech on that occasion was made by an 89-year-old person, Kenneth Kaunda, former president of Zambia. And I have it on authority that he was inspired to make this pretty lively contribution by listening to the president of Tanzania boasting about Tanzania's contribution to the liberation of Southern Africa, particularly its contribution to the ANC. And Kenneth Kaunda turned to the then vice president of Zambia, Guy Scott, now the acting president, and said, "We can't let him get away with this." And he was making 2 points. One, to emphasize Zambia's contribution to the ANC, which was huge, as the ANC had its headquarters in Zambia for most of the exile period, but also emphasizing Kaunda's own personal connection with Mandela, which went back to that tour around Africa that Mandela made from January 1962. And I think the personal link, the personal connection is important. And I've published a book about the history of the ANC in exile in Zambia. And I have undertaken to talk about Zambia and Mandela and the Zambian connection. But as a way into that, let me address also the theme that's come up in the previous two papers, which is the connection, the issue of Mandela and communism. And the issue of Mandela, communism, and Zambia, these are closely related because it was the Zambian reaction to rumours very energetically propagated by the rival Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, about the ANC-SACP alliance. And Mandela's response to that reaction, because he basically discovered when he travelled around Africa in 1962 that the PAC got there before him and had spread quite strong rumours about the alleged sort of white communist and white control of the ANC. And it was Mandela's reaction to that which was very important in determining the ongoing relationship between the ANC and the SACP during the exile period. I'll come back to that. I don't want to spend a lot of time addressing this issue, but I have to say something. I've read most of the relevant archival records and interviews in the public domain, and unlike Stephen, and to some extent unlike Tom, I remain convinced that there's no compelling reason to doubt Mandela's repeated assertions that he was never a member of the South African Communist Party. But in the recently published, very recently, just a few months ago, published Cambridge Companion to Mandela, we're told in categorical terms by Philip Bonner, a reputable historian, Mandela, joined the underground Communist Party of South Africa, which had reconstituted itself clandestinely in 1953. And in another chapter of the same book, we are told a little more tentatively by Jonathan Hislop, a reputable social historian, then around 1958, it appears Mandela joined the Communist Party. And I'm alarmed that a new kind of orthodoxy is gaining ground. And this is based largely on an article that Stephen published and also on the book that he recently published. In the article he claimed that he had proved beyond reasonable doubt that Mandela was a member of the South African Communist Party. And I really think I noticed that in his presentation earlier on, backtracked a bit. He didn't emphasise membership, he emphasised co-option onto the Central Committee, which is possible because he may well have been co-opted in his capacity as leader of MK. There's been a change in position. But the problem is that on the basis of the earlier article, it is becoming accepted that this is almost, if there is such a thing, an historical fact. And I simply don't think that it is. And this claim is linked with what I see as a revival of the apartheid government's legend that the SACP, acting on the instructions of Moscow and/or Peking, decided to launch the armed struggle, and they did, again to quote Stephen, bounced the ANC into this. And the implication is that the ANC was pushed into armed struggle against its will or better judgment by the SACP. And I don't think there's any reason to believe this. There was a lot of pressure towards a desabotage and armed struggle coming from below. And more importantly, the ANC was in intense competition with the PAC. And the PAC made a move towards armed struggle before the ANC. And leaders of the ANC were well aware that they were in the competition for radicalism. with the PAC. With or without the SACP, they would have made this move. And actually, I find the revival of what I regard as Cold War arguments as disturbing, because underlying them there was something which was potentially racist and even anti-Semitic in these arguments. It was put about that leaders of the ANC were not capable of making this kind of initiative, that they were pushed into it by an SACP which was seen as white-dominated and actually frequently as Jewish-dominated. And the PAC made a specific point about this, that when talking to leaders of Arab countries in Africa, they would say that the ANC was being manipulated by the SACP, the SACP was being manipulated by Jews who were Zionists. So these are actually quite sinister arguments. And I also find the presentation of the ANC as a front for the SACP. This is the argument which the British, the Americans accepted and used to justify their failure to take any real action against apartheid for a period of most of 30 years, until the late 1980s. Turning to the evidence, as I say, I've looked at the evidence, and there's no substantial evidence for Mandela's membership, being a member of the SACP. What there is circumstantial evidence. And a lot of it is, I think, Stephen just quoted 8 people who either have said, written, or hinted. Well, yes, said, written, or hinted. But every one of those statements you can find some fault with, or can be contradicted. Joe Matthews, for example, said that he was himself co-opted onto the Central Committee of the SACP in 1960. He didn't say that Mandela was a member of the Central Committee, but he said that he'd seen him at meetings in 1960. Bob Heppel attended those meetings in 1960. He said he never saw him there. He wasn't there then. So there's a circumstantial evidence, none of which is, in my view, conclusive. Nobody denies that Mandela was close to the SACP, that he may have attended Central Committee meetings, and that in underground conditions, the lines between these two organizations were blurred. And a meeting of Central Committee of the SACP might actually have been a meeting of 3 people in the back of a beetle. We're not talking about big meetings or party lists and that kind of thing. And against all this, what I think very weak evidence for Mandela's actual membership of the SACP, you have to say his own repeated statements. In the treason trial in 1960, I did not become a communist. Incidentally, his very distinguished lawyer, Sidney Kentridge, told Anthony Sampson that he was absolutely certain that Mandela was never a member of the SACP. Or Mandela's statement in the Rivonia trial, I have never been a member of the Communist Party. Or the fact that the South African government itself accepted in 1967 Mandela's request that he should not be listed as a communist. He wrote to the Minister of Justice, 23rd of October 1967, I've never been a member or active supporter of the Communist Party of South Africa or its successor, the SACP. You can't find anything much more categorical than that. So why is there this determination to assert that Mandela, a lawyer, one of the world's most respected people, habitually lied under oath in statements from the dock, in letters to the government, in his autobiographies about his membership of the SACP? I don't know. But in making a plea for Mandela's honesty, I'm not suggesting that there would have been anything disgraceful about his being a member of the SACP. Its predecessor, the Communist Party of South Africa, was South Africa's first non-racial party. And there's no need for me to list the names of leading opponents of apartheid who were at one time or another members of the Communist Party. It seems hardly necessary to emphasize that communism means different things in different places, that communist parties have different national cultures, and the SACP was South African, not Soviet. My good friend, great South African communist Jack Simons, always used to say, I'm a South African communist. I'm not a Soviet communist. So I would emphasize, again, say, there's no compelling reason to doubt that Mandela remained outside the SACP. And also that the founding of MK was primarily an ANC initiative. And it was formed in 1961 as a body that was formally independent of the ANC, the Congress Alliance, and the SACP. And it was set up in this way because some leaders of the ANC, both the ANC and the SACP, doubted the wisdom of the move towards armed struggle. Chief Albert Tuli, President General of the ANC, Moses Katani, General Secretary of the SACP, he was also Treasurer of the ANC, were both profoundly sceptical. They doubted that political avenues of struggle had been exhausted. And there was a very strong tradition of non-violence in the ANC and Congress alliance, especially in the Indian Congress. So again, I'm taking issue with I will quote some quotations from the Rivonia trial speech, the very well-known speech, one of the great speeches of the 20th century. And unlike Stephen, I agree. I think that Mandela was speaking the truth. I don't think he was obfuscating issues. Well, he said in the Rivonia trial speech, he said, "I want to say that the suggestion made by the state that the struggle in South Africa is under the influence of foreigners or communists is wholly incorrect. I've done whatever I did, both as an individual and as a leader of my people, because of my experience in South Africa and my only proudly felt African background, and not because of what any outsider might have said." And the idea which Stephen just put forward, that MK was founded by a meeting of the SACP in December 1960, is really is just not tenable. It's fairly obscure what that decision was, but it's certain that it wasn't in any way binding on the ANC. And the fact that Moses Katani, the leader of the South African Communist Party, could 6 months later speak strongly against the turn-to-arms struggle in an ANC meeting is an indication that no very firm decision had been made. And so that the reasons for the keeping of MK separate from the ANC and the SACP are clear, and they remain, and they hold. Mandela, in the Rivonia trial speech, was also very clear about his perception of the difference between the ANC and the Communist Party. He said, "The ANC, unlike the Communist Party, admitted Africans only as members. Its chief goal was and is for the African people to win unity and full political rights. The Communist Party's main aim, on the other hand, was to remove the capitalists and replace them with a working class government. The Communist Party sought to emphasize class distinctions, while the ANC seeks to harmonize them. This is a vital distinction." Going on, he said, "It is true that there has often been close cooperation between the ANC and the Communist Party. But cooperation is merely proof of a common goal, in this case, the removal of white supremacy, and is not proof of a complete community of interests." Again, in the same speech, he said, "As I understand the state case, in particular the evidence of Mr. X, the state witness Bruno Mtolo, the suggestion is that Umkhonto was the inspiration of the Communist Party, which sought to enroll the African people into an army which ostensibly was to fight for African freedom, but in reality was fighting for a communist state. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the suggestion is preposterous. Umkhonto was formed by Africans to further their struggle for freedom in their own land. Communists and others supported the movement. We only wish that more sections of the community would join us." Okay, let me turning more to the Zambian connection. This really begins with Mandela's African trip, between January and July 1962, during which he attended the Pan-African Freedom Movement for East Central and Southern Africa Conference in Addis Ababa. And Mandela was actually shocked to find that the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress, had got around Africa ahead of the ANC and had successfully planted in the minds of many the ideas that the PAC, was the radical movement. The ANC was not truly Pan-Africanist because of its involvement with the multiracial Congress alliance and its alliance with what was portrayed as a white-dominated SACP. And it's quite strange that similar arguments were being used against the communist influence in the ANC by the apartheid government and the ANC's main rival, the PAC. Well, Mandela was aware that Zambia and Tanzania, as the frontline states, would be the most important bases for the ANC's external mission and the launching pads for any armed struggle, which, of course, they did become. He didn't visit Zambia this time, which was then Northern Rhodesia. He overflew it in January 1962 and again on his way back in July. But he did meet Kaunda and other Zambian leaders in Tanganyika, Ethiopia, and Egypt. He also met Julius Nyerere and other Tanganyikan leaders. Both Kaunda and Nyerere were personally sympathetic and supportive. But in his memoir, Mandela recalled, "Oliver Tambo and I had a private discussion with Kenneth Kaunda. He told us he was concerned about our alliance with white communists and indicated this reflected poorly policy in Africa. And then Mandela says, this view came as something of a revelation to me. It was a view that I was to hear over and over during my trip. And then he had a day-long meeting with Reuben Kamanga, vice president of the Zambian party UNIP in Cairo, and Kamanga told him, we've heard disturbing reports from the PAC to the effect that Umkhonto we Sizwe is the brainchild of the Communist Party and the Liberal Party, and that the idea of the organisation is merely to use Africans as cannon fodder. Mandela protested that, a bit surprised by this. He said, I'm surprised the Liberal Party and the Communist Party were arch enemies who couldn't come together to play a game of cards. But he said, speaking at the risk of some immodesty, I myself was the prime mover behind MK's formation. And I don't doubt that statement. In a contemporary report to the National Working Committee of the ANC, he wrote, there are great reservations about our policy, and there is a widespread feeling that the ANC is a communist-dominated organisation. The mere allegation that you are a stooge is of itself so damaging, it must automatically discredit the ANC. He's not saying that it's true, he's saying that if people spread this rumour, it's not good news. And he also pointed out, because this was a double-sided thing, that the award of the Nobel Peace Prize to Chief Luthuli had created the impression that Luthuli has been bought by the West, that he's a stooge of white. So the same argument actually was being made from an anti-communist and an anti-liberal, basically an anti-white position. And in London in June 1962, Mandela took a hard line, and he told Yusuf Dadoo, exile representative of the SACP, and Vela Pillay, that there'd have to be a change of tactics, a new emphasis on an African image, a phrase which he used, if the ANC was to gain acceptance in independent Africa. And on his return to South Africa in July 1962, Mandela told his colleagues in the ANC's National Working Committee the same thing. And in his memoirs, he recalled, still ringing in my ears, was my final meeting with the Zambian leaders, who told me that they were bewildered by the ANC's non-racialism and communist ties. So in fact, it was it was the non-racialism and the association with whites which were equally problematic. He told the Working Committee that Oliver Tambo and I believed that the ANC had to appear more independent to reassure our new allies on the continent, for they were the ones who would be financing and training Umkhonto we Sizwe. I proposed reshaping the Congress alliance so that the ANC would clearly be seen as leader, especially on issues directly affecting Africans. And he insisted that our friends, by which he meant SACP members and the Congress alliance, must understand that it is the ANC that is part of the struggle. And at that meeting, Moses Katani, leader of the SACP as well as a leading member of the ANC, agreed that the ANC would stand on its own outside, would have to be some modification of the way of cooperation inside. Well, Katani and J.B. Marks, both leading African members of the ANC and SACP, soon left South Africa and became the leading representatives of the ANC in Dar es Salaam. And they required, in line with the decision that had been made in the presence of Mandela in 1962, there should be no distinct SACP representation in Africa. Basically, they were saying the SACP will not exist in places like Tanzania and Zambia, and it will not be allowed to organise cells within the ANC in exile in Africa. It wasn't, in fact, until after the Morogoro Conference in 1969 that the ANC allowed the SACP to organise cells in urban centres in Zambia and Tanzania within the ANC. But there was still no permission from the ANC for the SACP to organise cells within Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, which in any case had been reduced to a tiny group, about 100 strong in the early 1970s. People like Chris Hani and James April, leading members of MK and veterans of the Wankie campaign, were both critical of the hard line that Katani and Marx took against the SACP organising in Africa and within MK. But it has to be emphasised that it was leading African members of the SACP, also leading members of the ANC, who took this line. And it's reasonable to suggest that as nationalists, they put the ANC first, were determined to safeguard its position in the host countries. It wasn't, in fact, until the late 1970s that the SACP was able to organise cells within MK in the Angolan camps, and then it had to do this clandestinely, if you read James Nulu's book. I mean, this position was tactical, and globally, the informal alliance continued. The SACP was useful to the ANC as a link to the USSR, which was a major source of funding from 1963 until the mid-1970s. By 1976, Scandinavian sources were much more important. For the late 70s, right through to the end, Swedish aid and support was much more important than Soviet or Eastern Bloc support. And I have also to say that the SACP was never recognised in Zambia or Tanzania as a separate liberation movement, was never able to hold public meetings in either country, could only exist underground within the ANC. So people who assert SACP dominance of the ANC may be surprised that the SACP had such a subordinate role in Zambia, Tanzania, and only a very small percentage, actually, of ANC members were ever also members of the SACP, and the cell structure meant that they could never actually meet together. They didn't necessarily know who the other members were. Well, in conclusion, I'd just like to say something about the ongoing connection between Kaunda and Mandela. And I think, as I said at the beginning, the personal link, the personal bond established in 1962 was important. Because Mandela was the only member of the ANC's internal and imprisoned leadership that Kaunda or Nyerere had ever met. In 1964, after the Rivonia trial judgment, Kaunda wrote to President Donges of South Africa, offering a non-aggression pact in exchange for the release to Zambia of Mandela and other Rivonia trial prisoners. There was no response, but Kaunda raised the question of Mandela's release again in correspondence with Forster in 68-9, 74-5. There was even a rumour circulating among exiles in Lusaka in the mid-70s that Mandela had been secretly flown to Zambia for talks at Lusaka's State House with Forster. Not true, but Tambo had to call upon Mac Maharaj, who'd just been released from Robben Island, to refute this rumour on his arrival in Lusaka in 1977. And it was, I think, in response to a request from Kaunda when Kaunda met Botha on the Botswana border in 1982 that the South African government first seriously considered the release of Mandela, resulting in an offer for his conditional release to the Transkei in 1984, an offer which was rejected by Zinzi at a UDF, his daughter Zinzi at a UDF rally in 1985. Well, I think I'm under pressure to stop. But as a result of which I will do in a minute. Yeah. Well, the last point I was going to make was about the Eminent Persons Group and the very surprising combination of pressures from Margaret Thatcher and Kenneth Kaunda working together, which basically compelled P.W. Botha to accept the mission of the Commonwealth Eminent Persons Group to South Africa in 1986. And that was very important because it was the first time that they met Mandela in Pollsmoor. It was the first time that Mandela really became part of a public negotiation process. It was also as a result of that move that Britain and the United States for the first time recognized the ANC. It was only then that British and American diplomats were permitted by their governments to speak to the ANC. Thanks.
Thank you, Hugh.